Let me give you one number, just one, and I want you to sit with it for exactly 5 seconds before we go anywhere. $94,804. That is how many dollars the United States national debt grew by and the time it took you to read that sentence. Not per minute, not per hour, per second. Every second of every hour of every day, the debt grows by nearly $95,000. While you sleep, while you work, while you watch this video, the clock never stops. As of June 2026, the total gross national debt of the United States is $39.2 trillion. That is $290,860 per American household, not per millionaire, not per corporation, per household. Your household. The one with the mortgage and the car payment and the grocery bill that keeps going up. And here is the part that most coverage of this number misses completely. The debt itself is almost not the point anymore. The interest on the debt is the point. Because something happened in 2026 that has never happened before in American history and that almost nobody is talking about clearly enough. For the first time ever, the United States government is now spending more money paying interest on its debt than it spends on national defense, more than Medicare, more than Medicaid. At a projected cost of $1 trillion in fiscal year 2026, interest payments have surpassed the $885 billion spent on national defense and $708 billion spent on Medicaid. $1 trillion gone before a single road gets paved, before a single veteran gets treated, before a single student loan gets processed, just to service the balance on a credit card that the federal government has been swiping for decades without paying it off. My name is Ryan, and I spend a genuinely unreasonable amount of time reading the CBO projections, the Treasury data, and the places where fiscal math becomes the kind of problem that keeps serious economists awake at night. If you have ever wondered whether the national debt is something you should actually care about, or just a number that politicians wave around to score points, subscribe and hit that like button, because today we are going through the real story, what the debt actually is, what the interest trajectory actually means, the specific moment when it stops being an abstract problem and starts being a personal one, and the one thing that could either save or accelerate every projection you are about to hear. Let's build the full picture. The numbers behind the number. As of June 3rd, 2026, total gross national debt is $39.20 trillion. Debt held by the public is $31.60 trillion. Intragovernmental debt is $7.61 trillion. The distinction between those two categories matters. Intragovernmental debt is money the government owes to itself, the Social Security Trust Fund, the Medicare Trust Fund, government accounts that hold Treasury securities as a store of value. That $7.6 trillion is real, but it functions differently from the public debt, which is money owed to actual external creditors, bondholders, foreign governments, pension funds, you if you own a treasury bond or a money market fund that holds them. The debt as a percentage of GDP was 123% as of the fourth quarter of 2025. The nation's debt to GDP first surpassed 100% in the fourth quarter of 2012. That ratio matters because it contextualizes the debt against the size of the economy generating the revenue to service it. A household with $50,000 in debt and a $200,000 income is in a completely different position than a household with $50,000 in debt and a $30,000 income. The debt to GDP ratio is the equivalent of that calculation at the national level. At 123%, the United States owes roughly $1.23 for every dollar its economy generates in a year. That is not catastrophic on its own. Japan has run a debt-to-GDP ratio above 200% for years without triggering the collapse that debt hawks have periodically predicted. But Japan has unique structural features, a high domestic savings rate, a captive domestic bond market, that the United States does not fully replicate. The comparison is real, but not a complete comfort. The rate of debt increase over the past year has averaged $8.19 billion per day, $341 million per hour, $5.69 million per minute, or $94,804 per second. Assuming the average daily rate continues, the U.S. will reach $40 trillion by approximately September 23, 2026. $40 trillion by September this year. That milestone is not theoretical. It is a calendar date. The interest problem, the one that is already here. Here is the sequence of events that turned the debt from an abstract concern into an operational crisis for the federal budget. For most of the decade between 2010 and 2021, interest rates were essentially zero, which meant that even as the debt grew, the cost of carrying it remained manageable. The government could borrow at 1%, 1.5%, sometimes less. The interest bill was large in absolute terms, but stable as a share of the budget. Then inflation hit. The Fed raised rates faster than at any point in 4 decades. And the debt, which had to be refinanced as old bonds matured and new ones were issued, suddenly had to be rolled over at 4%, 5%, and higher. Interest payments were $352 billion in 2021. The CBO projects that annual amount exceeded $1 trillion in 2026 and will double to reach $2.1 trillion by 2036. From $352 billion to $1 trillion in 5 years, a 184% increase. Not because the government suddenly borrowed dramatically more than before, partly that, but mostly because the rate environment changed and the existing debt repriced into a world where money costs real money again. Relative to the size of the economy, interest costs reached 3.3% of GDP in 2026, eclipsing the previous high set in 1991. As a share of federal revenues, federal interest payments rose to 18.6% this year, above the previous high set in 1991. 18.5 cents of every tax dollar collected gone to interest before the government funds a single program, maintains a single highway, pays a single federal employee. The interest payment is the bill that arrives before the menu. Interest costs will exceed Medicare spending by fiscal year 2028. They will exceed defense and non-defense discretionary spending combined by 2038. And by 2048, interest will become the single largest federal government expenditure. The federal government will soon be spending more to service the past than to make productive investments in the future. That last sentence deserves to be read again slowly. Spending more to service the past than to invest in the future. The country is carrying a balance so large that servicing it crowds out the decisions that would generate growth. Infrastructure, research, education, the things that compound for a nation the way investment compounds for an individual. The debt spiral risk. The scenario nobody wants to say plainly. Here's the part that the serious economists are starting to say in careful language that deserves to be translated into plain English. A committee for a responsible federal budget analysis of CBO's February 2026 baseline projections shows that the average interest rate paid on the national debt could exceed the economic growth rate starting in fiscal year 2031. If this occurs on a sustained basis, the U.S. risks a debt spiral. When interest costs increase interest rates and depress growth, and depressed growth further increases interest costs, absent significant fiscal reforms. A debt spiral. That phrase has been used to describe Argentina, Greece, nations that lost the confidence of bond markets and faced the consequences in the form of currency crises, austerity measures, and economic contractions that took years to recover from. The United States is not Argentina. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency gives America a structural advantage that no other country possesses. Demand for U.S. treasuries is global and deep. As of May 2026, the bid-to-cover ratio for treasury bills is 3.07, for 10-year notes is 2.40, and for 30-year bonds is 2.30, all reflecting strong continued demand. The world is still buying America's debt, enthusiastically, but that demand is not unconditional. A series of weak treasury auctions in March 2026 added to concerns about weakening demand for a growing supply of federal debt created by deficits. Primary dealers took 24% of a 2-year note auction in late March, roughly twice the share normally absorbed by these dealers. 5- and 7-year securities saw weak demand. When primary dealers absorb an unusually large share of a treasury auction, it means voluntary buyers stepped back. It is not a crisis, it is a signal. The bond market occasionally sends signals before it sends consequences. March 2026 was a signal. CBO's baseline projections show that the deficit widens from $1.9 trillion in 2026 to $3.1 trillion in 2036. Debt held by the public rises from 101% of GDP this year to to 120% in 2036, higher than at any point in the nation's history. Over the following 2 decades, growing deficits push federal debt to 175% of GDP in 2056. 175% of GDP by 2056. CBO projects gross federal debt will reach $182 trillion by 2056, equivalent to roughly $2 million per American family of 4. What it means for you right now, not in 2056. Here is where the abstract number becomes a personal finance question. The debt does not hurt you the way a bill in your mailbox hurts you. It hurts you through the channels that are already running. The first channel is interest rates. When the government borrows $1.9 trillion in a single year, it competes with private borrowers for the same pool of capital. That competition keeps rates higher than they would otherwise be. The mortgage rate that is making home ownership feel impossible, the credit card rate sitting north of 20%, the small business loan that did not pencil out. All of them carry a hidden federal debt surcharge that nobody itemizes on your statement. Social Security's primary trust fund is now projected to be depleted in 2032, a year earlier than last year's projections. The Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund will be depleted in 2033. When those trust funds are depleted, the law currently requires automatic benefit cuts unless Congress acts. The 2032 date for Social Security is 6 years away. Anyone currently 59 or older is planning a retirement on a benefit structure that faces structural insolvency inside their own retirement window. The second channel is the crowding out effect. Interest costs so far in fiscal year 2026 have been the second largest spending category for the federal government, outpacing all budget categories except Social Security. Every dollar going to interest is a dollar not going to roads, bridges, broadband, medical research, or the programs that most Americans say they want the government to fund. The debt does not default. It just slowly eliminates the fiscal space to do anything else. How worried should you actually be? Here is the honest answer that neither the catastrophists nor the dismissers are giving you. The national debt is not going to cause the United States to collapse tomorrow. The dollar is still the world's reserve currency. Treasury demand is still global and strong. The bond market is not running yet. But the trajectory is not sustainable by any serious measure. As Maya McGuinness, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, said clearly, markets will only tolerate our unsustainable borrowing for so long. The risk of a fiscal crisis gets higher as the days pass. We need deficit reduction urgently. The right level of personal worry is not panic. It is not dismissal either. It is the specific alertness of someone who understands that the interest bill already exceeded the defense budget this year, that it will double by 2036, that Social Security faces insolvency in 6 years without legislative action, that the mortgage rate in your city carries a debt premium you didn't vote for, and that the political will to address any of this before it becomes a market-forced reckoning has, so far, not materialized from either party in any meaningful way. The debt grows by $94,804 every second. The interest on it just crossed $1 trillion a year for the first time in history. And the CBO's own projections say we are on an unsustainable path by every metric they track. That is not a reason to panic. It is a reason to pay attention, to understand what your representatives are and are not doing about it, to build your own financial resilience against an environment where rates stay higher for longer and where government benefits you are counting on may arrive in a different form than the one currently promised. The clock is running. It runs while you sleep. It ran while you watched this, and the only thing that has ever actually slowed it down is a political decision that so far neither party has been willing to make while the consequences still felt far enough away. If this gave you a clearer, more honest picture of what the national debt actually means for your life right now, subscribe, because next time we are going inside the one policy tool that economists across the political spectrum agree could actually stabilize the debt trajectory, and the specific reason neither party will touch it in an election year. I'll see you in that one.